Today, we're talking about reading. Wait, don't fall asleep. Reading's important. It's not the only thing we need, but without it, some of us will be lost. I'm Chris, and this is what had to be said. I think on the face of it, you and I can agree that reading philosophy or knowing the right theory is not a necessary condition for fighting back and liberating oneself. People naturally rebel against illegitimate authority. Think about slave rebellions. You think slaves can't figure out they're enslaved, that their situation is unjust, and that they can fight back? Do slaves need to read Marx or Bakunin to wake up and want to free themselves? They might just need some guns. For a more relevant example, how much theory do you think the people in Minneapolis needed to read to think of burning down the police station and the big box store that was supporting them, the police? Did they need leaders well-versed in some kind of philosophy of liberation? I think they just needed to understand their own situation, and they acted accordingly. So you've got millions of people who see the system for what it is because they live it. Barely 10 kilometers away from where I grew up, there's a reserve for Mohawk people. They were herded into one territory so that white settlers could have the best land. They were used to the police state harassing them and kidnapping and killing them. They knew it was for land and resources to keep them in poverty and fighting for their existence. They didn't have to read to understand that. Then there was me, growing up just across the river, oblivious to all of it. I never even saw the police when I was growing up. They were just these mustaches on the news. We never learned the real history of the land we lived on. Of course, God forbid you should tell a child the truth. I've learned from books, but also from a lot just from listening to the experiences of colonized, racialized people on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. But barring a few sporadic experiences, it's all secondhand knowledge. I've had to seek out these voices, most of which were only ever accessible to me thanks to the internet. That's a great example of privilege, by the way, to grow up so isolated from reality and only learn about it later from other people. But at least I'm learning to recognize my privilege through reading at first, thanks to also listening to people. And thanks to listening to people, I can throw my full support behind the people in the US who are fighting back against the police state right now. This channel isn't driven by news, as you might know, but right now is a great opportunity to apply the theory that we've been talking about and learning. We're seeing decentralized insurrection, and in the US, the heart of the empire. There's plenty of theory or history that can explain these events, but nothing you would learn in school. All of us are oppressed and bamboozled by the system we live under, and we're all indoctrinated to believe in it, and most of us are in a subordinate position, but we're not all slaves or targets for state-sanctioned murder. If you just gave us guns, we might side with our oppressors against whoever they say are the enemy. We have varying amounts of power and wealth, different positions in the social hierarchy according to so many different factors. People like me are somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy. The structure of rulers and ruled is not so obvious from the middle. In my case, theory's been necessary for me to see the system I live under for what it is. I had seen plenty of evidence that capitalism was a cruel system that destroys lives. Look at the people who are enslaved in workshops making our clothes or mining parts for our electronics. Look how millions of people work long hours for pitiful wages their whole lives. And people who don't participate in the system and play someone else's game get kicked out of their homes and into the street, and then maybe to jail. I knew all these things were going on, but I still didn't understand the system was responsible for them. I thought they were just mistakes or holes you could plug up, flaws in an otherwise correct system. I didn't realize this is how the system is supposed to work. It wasn't accident and bad luck and coincidence and the wrong people in power. Systems of oppression exist to take from the ruled and give to the rulers. But it took me a long while to learn all of that. I needed to hear that from at least 2 other people, because that's kind of how learning new things tends to work. You need to hear it from not just one other person, that one person who's been saying it to you all this time, but also that one other person who's a bit further outside your life. And then you go, if that person thinks so too. And then after that, I had to learn about the history of the state and the history of capitalism to test all that I had heard, to apply it, to see if it really lines up with reality. Because I was still in the grip of the rhetoric of democracy. Democracy means rule by the people, supposedly. So, as long as a system is called a democracy, it can somehow be made to work for the people, right? Because the people running it and benefiting from it say it's a democracy. So, really, we, the people, must be in charge. I believed a lot of things like this about democracy after studying political science for 4 years. In poli-sci, you read a lot of theory, and then you apply the theory to some place or group or historical event. But I never read anything that shattered these basic beliefs we were taught about liberal democracy, capitalism, and socialism. I think there are a few reasons for that. For one, we learned some critical thinking in class, but only in bits and pieces. We never studied the system as a whole, and we never learned to question its existence. In my grad school classes, I would bring up points that were fundamental to the system we were discussing, and the professors would kind of brush them aside. Yeah, but that's not what we're talking about. I think they just didn't want to lose control of the conversation and maybe weren't ready to talk about solutions. When you leave your most basic assumptions unquestioned, you're missing key parts of the puzzle. We mostly read and discussed the mainstream discourse. Nothing radical, just the same things all poli-sci students learn. But at least I didn't stop reading and thinking and observing after my undergrad. Eventually, like 3 years later, I heard about anarchist philosophy. And it was the first time any theory had brought together all the things I had been learning about and fit them together. So in my case, I had the relevant book knowledge, but without theory, I couldn't piece it together into what seems like pretty obvious conclusions to me today. I don't know about your case. Maybe you haven't studied these things for 20 years like I have. Understandable. Or maybe you're young and you don't have a lot of life experience. I don't know. That's okay. You can still read theory or listen to the audiobooks. It's just as good. And see if what they say aligns with reality. And remember, that's not just what you've been told or what you want to be true. In fact, learning to see things through the eyes of an anarchist is kind of an unpleasant wake-up call. If your goal is to get a politician elected, you might be successful. Anarchist theory made me realize, finally, that it doesn't matter who gets elected in an involuntary system. That no one has the right to rule others, and that it's okay to fight back against illegitimate authority. But fighting back is a lot harder than getting someone elected. The more you learn from anarchist theory, the more you realize how daunting the task before you is. But that's okay. I don't want the easy answers peddled by so much political theory out there. A lot of philosophy teaches people to accept their lot, however shitty. Maybe through the promise of an afterlife, maybe because of assumptions about right and wrong, or what's possible, or what's desirable. Some people told me just today, the solution to police brutality and violence is contacting legislators and making new laws and reforms and so on. They've been trying that for decades or centuries now, and the problem's still there. So whatever theory got you to believe in that nonsense is a worthless theory. Then there are theories about superficial concerns like voting, instead of incisive critiques of the dominant institutions of society. That's the thing about thinking in new ways. It changes your priorities. It turns your head and focuses your eyes. In my experience, not all philosophy is worth my time. If your readings just reinforce the status quo, what are they worth to you? If they don't have solutions that you can implement, how useful are they? There are thousands of opinion pieces masquerading as serious proposals, but that don't take into account the nature of the institutions they hope will implement the solutions. They say the government should do this and that, without mentioning policymakers have no incentive to do that. They assume the only relevant actors are governments and corporations, as if you can't do anything without them. Sometimes I read things about how the whole system is fundamentally flawed, and the solution they offer is to reform the system. Like in the book, The Corporation, which is similar to the movie. In case you've ever watched the movie, I don't think anyone's read the book. It's a biting critique of capitalism, and the obvious conclusion to draw is to abolish capitalism, or at least abolish the corporation. But the book says the answer is government regulations. Government is owned by corporations, but more government will stop corporations. That solution does not follow from your conclusions. It's like bringing someone into the doctor's office, diagnosing them with COVID, giving them an aspirin, and sending them on their way. Or in fact, since regulations are written by corporate lobbyists for the benefit of the corporations they work for, suggesting more regulations is like skipping even the aspirin and giving them a pangolin to take home. There you go, try not to die. On the other hand, you have socialism. Socialists explain the nature of the problems caused by capitalism and then came up with a solution, transferring the means of production to the workers. Anarchist theory, I think, complements Marx or whatever socialist you read by showing why we shouldn't just trust small cliques of people to be in charge of everything. So the means of production should be commonly owned or unowned, rather than controlled by the state. Obviously, there's a lot more to these ideas, but at least they're coherent ideologies that illuminate and provide solutions. Now, I've read plenty besides anarchist theory, and it's all useful in some way. You want to read widely because you never know what can help you. No single school of philosophy has everything figured out. You also want to know about history and how to think critically about history, or read, all the social sciences. What these things offer is ways of thinking about the world. Some of what you read is informed by real evidence, and some is informed by biases, lies, mistakes, and misinterpretations. But you can also read critiques of a given study or of the field as a whole. And you should. There's plenty of criticism of the social sciences. Some common criticism includes, in a nutshell, the artificial divisions among overlapping fields, the fact that these fields have been developed and dominated by white men, and that they've often worked in the service of empire. So it matters who you read and who signs their checks. It's not necessary for the writer to be writing in bad faith for their writing to contribute to the problem. It's the system that matters. Just like it doesn't matter how nice the police officer you know is. They work for a system of oppression. In the case of academics and think tank fellows, their funding comes from someone else, which influences their research priorities and findings, too. It's a question of incentives. Who wants to rock the boat when you can get grants and book deals and tenure? As I mentioned, reading can change your priorities if you let them. People are used to being told what to think and what to think is important, too. So when they think of violence, as an example, they think of things like random acts of terrorism or drug gangs. Not only are these kinds of violence caused by state violence indirectly, they're extremely minor sources of violence compared to the police, the military, and the prison, or for that matter, domestic violence. And I've read a lot of shitty books and shitty takes that reinforce this way of thinking rather than challenge it. They say we when they mean the US government, and we need a government response when a government response might have been the problem all along. I can't count how many books and articles I've read and speeches I've heard that talk about terrorism or drugs as if they're these huge global problems that require huge global responses involving police, militaries, huge new government bureaucracies with huge budgets, instead of solving the problems by ending military aggression and legalizing drugs. But if they solve these problems, these writers and speakers and bureaucrats would have to find jobs. So they speak vaguely of state solutions, even though states have the incentive to prolong problems indefinitely so they can continue to exercise control and find a way to help someone else profit from them. Whereas I would say if it's worth doing, the people should do it for themselves, so they don't have to sit around hoping the state will do it for them in the way they want it done and with the results they're hoping for. Books should challenge your thinking. I needed theory followed by observation to scrub out my indoctrination. But some people can figure it out through observation alone. And once you've learned these things, you can do something. Continuous learning is great, but you don't need to read every possible theory to act. Don't let your incomplete knowledge cripple you, and don't let your expert knowledge confuse you. Have you ever seen this? Oh, and by the way, quick content warning for blood, sorry.
Maybe there's a more concrete approach. Here, let's try this.
Oh, God! Michael, what did you do?
I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Make a choice.
The thing is, ethically speaking...
No time, dude! Make a decision!
Well, it's tricky. On the one hand, if you ascribe to a purely utilitarian worldview...
Okay. So, what did we learn?
The point is, you might know enough already. At some point, you need to act on what you know. Another thing to bear in mind is not everyone learns by sitting down and reading a book. there might be much more effective ways for you to learn. That's partly why this channel exists, to break down and synthesize theory and make it accessible. But some people would learn better with games or listening to music. Find out what works best for you. And actually, that whole learning styles thing isn't really based on a lot of evidence. For sure, people learn differently, but we probably don't have learning styles. Learning is really about practice. Now, what I talk about can kind of be practiced in some ways, but I'm usually not very specific because everything depends on you and what you think needs to be done in your local context. But you can learn it, or any theory, just by thinking about it, by gauging its validity for yourself, by applying it to history and applying it to your situation in the present. Don't feel like you have to read, or if you're on YouTube, listen to more than one sentence at a time, because you can always pause and think about it. If you think about it, you're more likely to remember it. So probably you can learn from theory, but maybe it's not necessary. Perspective is everything. It doesn't matter how you become conscious of the problem. Once you understand it enough, you can do something about it. But you also need appropriate solutions. The ideas are out there, but they don't get heard on the news, or in the workplace, or in politics, or in the classroom. Because that's where they're most needed, so that's where they would be most threatening.